Ukraine has just carried out one of its largest ground-based fire strikes since the war began. In this operation, a single BM-27 Uragan crew was tasked with firing a Soviet-designed heavy multiple-launch rocket system, still a key component of Ukraine's medium-range firepower. The target was anything but minor, a strategic Russian airbase hosting Tu-160 bombers, known as the White Swans, a core pillar of Russia's nuclear deterrent. These aircraft are capable of carrying long-range cruise missiles and strategic nuclear weapons. At 9:30 a.m., on the outskirts of Kharkiv, the BM-27 crew entered the final preparation phase for what, on paper, was supposed to be a routine mission. One salvo, one Russian airbase, then immediate withdrawal. But the battlefield never follows theory. Before continuing, leave your opinion below. Type 9 if you support Ukraine. Type 1 if you support Russia. And if you support peace, type 5. Get ready, the battle begins now. The moment the final checks were completed, the first warning appeared. Passive receivers across the vehicle spiked simultaneously. The frequency spectrum display lit up with a familiar signature. Zoopark M1, Russia's counter-battery radar, active at an estimated distance of 38 kilometers, scanning directly toward their position. Zoopark is not just a radar, it is a death stopwatch. Designed to detect artillery rounds the instant they leave the launcher, it back-calculates their trajectory and outputs, firing coordinates in under 30 seconds. In a heartbeat, what had seemed like a standard mission turned into a race against time, and the BM-27 crew suddenly became the prize at the end of a lethal equation. By standard estimates, they had roughly 6 minutes. 6 minutes for Russian radar to detect the launch, 6 minutes for the coordinates to be relayed to fire units, and 6 minutes before a salvo of 48 N-6E missiles from Russian S-400 launchers would respond, wiping the entire grid square off the map. The BM-27 Uragan is not a precision weapon, it is a sledgehammer. This 220mm rocket artillery system carries 16 launch tubes, each rocket weighing around 280 kilograms, with a warhead of roughly 90 kilograms of high explosive. Its effective range, 35 to 40 kilometers, is enough to blanket a target area hundreds of meters wide in a storm of destruction in mere seconds. There is no guidance, no mid-course correction. Everything depends on coordinates provided by Typhoon UAVs, Ukraine's deep penetration reconnaissance drones operating far inside enemy territory. An error of a few dozen meters would render the strike ineffective. But if the coordinates were correct, hangars, auxiliary runways, and technical infrastructure would be crushed in fire and shrapnel. In peacetime, receiving, verifying, and inputting coordinates takes about 3 minutes. Today, they had to force it under 90 seconds. Any slower meant being buried alongside their own launcher. The BM-27's 8x8 wheeled chassis hummed quietly in the darkness, the engine primed for a shoot and scoot escape. Each salvo not only burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars, it gambled the lives of the entire crew if they were even a moment late. At 10:27 a.m., thermal sensors suddenly triggered. On the northeastern horizon, multiple columns of hot exhaust erupted simultaneously, about 32 kilometers away. There was no doubt the Russian gunners had begun counterfire. The countdown to survival had officially started. At their flight speed, the BM-27's 220mm rockets would reach the target in under 2 to 3 minutes. This was not meter-by-meter accuracy. It was saturation fire, designed to crush an area before the enemy could react. The Uragan has no automated reload for sustained firing under panic conditions. It was built for a single, decisive salvo, then withdrawal. In theory, all 16 tubes could fire within 20 to 30 seconds. In reality, time was evaporating faster than theory allowed. That night, the crew had no concept of pauses between launches. They chose rapid fire, tight spacing, and immediate departure the moment the last tube was empty. The first Uragan rocket left the launcher, tearing through the night, turning the dark field into daylight in a single, blinding instant. A column of flame shot straight into the sky, leaving behind a perfect thermal signature for every Russian sensor within tens of kilometers. No one inside the cabin looked back. They didn't need to. They knew exactly what was happening. The gunner immediately shifted to the next tube, movements precise, mechanical. At the same moment, the driver twisted the ignition. The 8x8 chassis roared to life. The high-power diesel engine shaking like a beast awakened in the dead of winter. 10:36 a.m. The second rocket shrieked as it left the launcher, carving a spear of heat through the air, an unmistakable trail that Russian counter-battery systems picked up almost instantly. The Zoopark M1 solution tightened with ruthless efficiency. The trajectory was reconstructed in reverse, error margins crushed to just a few dozen meters, and the firing coordinates were broadcast simultaneously to multiple Russian fire units. Now the rockets flying toward them were no longer a theoretical threat. They were real hunters. A thin, distant but unmistakable whine sliced through the air. Less than 30 seconds to impact. 10:38 a.m. The third Uragan rocket kicked free of its tube. Its shockwave slammed into structures more than 200 meters away, blasting windows apart like scraps of paper. Heat buildup caused the launcher's camouflage paint to crack and blister, exposing scorched metal and abrasion marks from repeated recoil. Only a few tubes remained. The driver pushed the engine into the red line, foot buried on the accelerator, ready to launch the vehicle forward the instant the order came. Then the final salvo left the launcher. At that exact moment, the first Russian 48N-6E missiles slammed into the grid square. The BM-27 had abandoned less than 2 minutes earlier, gouging a deep crater into the ground. The 20-plus-ton vehicle lunged forward, escaping the kill zone by a razor-thin margin. Behind them, more missiles poured in, saturating the old coordinates. Russian fire was chasing ghosts that were no longer there. At the same time, Ukraine's Uragan rockets were racing in low, skimming toward a forward Russian airbase where Tu-160 strategic bombers sat dispersed along the runway and inside hardened shelters. No guidance, no mid-course updates. Only pre-calculated ballistic arcs, solid propellant burning at full force, and pure physics dragging warheads weighing nearly 300 kilograms toward their targets. More than 20 kilometers away, Russian air defense radars finally picked up the incoming salvo. On the screens, they appeared as fast, low-flying points of light, dropping through the edges of the optimal engagement envelope for many interceptors. In less than a minute, the equation would resolve. Either the Uragan warheads would slam into the Tu-160 parking areas, turning concrete, steel, and fuel into an ocean of fire, or they would fall short, tearing apart runways and infrastructure, still enough to paralyze the entire base. There was no exit for anyone. Fire control radars surged to maximum power, struggling to isolate the ballistic track of the lead BM-27 rocket from a dense background of clutter. On paper, this was an ideal scenario. Tu-M2 was built specifically to counter low-altitude, high-speed targets like this. An Uragan rocket inbound at roughly 700 to 800 kilometers per hour. No guidance, no maneuvering. Just a fixed trajectory defined by propellant burn and gravity. By the textbook, the outcome should have been simple, a clean intercept. But the battlefield does not follow textbooks. There was no evasive maneuver. What broke the tour crew's rhythm was signal fragmentation. The Uragan rocket cut through complex terrain clutter, its trajectory briefly masked as it skimmed ridgelines and large structures. On radar, the target trace flickered, unstable, causing the interception window to expand and contract unpredictably. The operators still fired. 2 Tor interceptors tore off the rails, clawing into the sky toward the pre-calculated intercept point. But when they arrived, the rocket had slipped through the kill zone by mere dozens of meters, close enough to rattle displays, not close enough to destroy it. An explosion detonated mid-air, shrapnel sweeping across the flight path. Behind it, another Uragan rocket, less than a second slower, flew straight into the disturbed airspace. This time, Tor adjusted in time. One interceptor locked onto a more stable thermal signature and detonated at close range. In the sky, the third Uragan rocket shattered, vanishing from radar in a burst of fire and metal. 2 remained. For the Tor M2, the threat was no longer singular. 2 ballistic targets, flying low, were entering the same engagement corridor. Air defense doctrine says to prioritize the nearest target. The reality of combat says to hope for luck. The operator switched to semi-manual mode, programmed 2 additional intercept attempts, and simultaneously transmitted an urgent warning over the radio toward Ryazan, where Pantsir S-1 systems were on alert. The next engagement produced better results. The blast wave from a Tor interceptor slammed into the lead Uragan rocket, deflecting it by several degrees, but not destroying it outright. The true kill happened moments later. Fragments shredded the remaining rocket body, causing catastrophic instability. Its trajectory began to oscillate violently before it dropped off the screen entirely. Only 1 rocket survived. It continued straight toward the airbase, where Tu-160 strategic bombers sat dispersed along the runway and inside hardened shelters. Pantsir S-1 tried to force its way into the fight, but the engagement geometry was brutal. The rocket approached from the very edge of the detection envelope, flying so low that radar struggled against terrain clutter, ground reflections, and active jamming. By the time the 57 E-6 interceptors were finally ready, the target had dropped into terrain-masked airspace, where interception shifts from difficult to nearly impossible. 10:42 a.m. The final Uragan crossed the last invisible boundary. Less than 8 kilometers from the bomber base, it entered its terminal phase, the point where everything becomes momentum and time. 4 Russian air defense systems slewed their sensors toward the same strip of metal, saturating the sky with radar energy from every angle. For Ukraine, the next 45 seconds would decide whether months of intelligence would erupt into a sea of fire among the Tu-160 seconds, or collapse into nothing more than a meaningless crater in concrete. The Tor crew knew this was the final chance. The tracking radar followed the target, skimming the terrain, then temporarily lost it as the rocket slipped behind a ridgeline. 15 seconds remained before it would crest and reappear. The last interceptor was pre-positioned at the predicted intercept point. The operator's finger rested on the trigger, waiting for the return of the signal. 3 kilometers to the south, a Pantsir S-1 finally forced its way into the engagement. On paper, it still had more than 10 missiles in the launcher. In reality, time was almost gone. Pantsir's radar was fighting ghosts, terrain clutter, false reflections, and dense electronic interference. Meanwhile, the remaining Uragan kept coming, low, fast, and undeniably real. On the northern berm of the base, the last hope did not come from any modern system at all. It came from a bulky Soviet-era relic, the ZSU-234 Shilka. 4 23mm autocannons began rotating their turret, ready to pour out thousands of rounds per minute. If the target entered the kill zone, metal would tear metal apart. The gunner locked onto the predicted approach vector. He believed the radar would give him a single, clean moment. It didn't. Russian fire control systems struggled to separate the incoming Uragan rocket from a chaotic background, where terrain, ground reflections, and electronic jamming overlapped like a signal storm. At that closing speed, the operator had less than 3 seconds to fire effectively. 10:48 a.m. The lead Uragan rocket cleared the ridgeline exactly as predicted. The Tor M2 launched its final interceptors the instant the target reappeared. But the rocket flew too low, hugging the terrain, slipping into a zone where time could no longer be reversed. The intercept window slammed shut. Less than a heartbeat later, the second surviving Uragan burst over the same ridgeline, offset nearly 2 kilometers to the north, on a completely different approach corridor. In an instant, Pantsir S-1 faced 2 targets at once, both driving straight toward the base. Caught off guard, the crew split their fire, 1 salvo per target, instead of concentrating everything on a single kill. The gamble nearly worked. 1 Pantsir interceptor caught the northern rocket while it was still at engagement altitude, detonating close enough to rip open its casing and scatter burning fragments across the fields north of Ryazan, but not close enough to stop it completely. Shots aimed at the lead Uragan arrived 1 heartbeat too late, slicing past by mere meters as the rocket continued its dive toward the base, unstoppable. The final Tor missiles tore through the air, passing so close that the operators held their breath. But their fuses triggered just after the target, ripping apart empty air as the rocket plunged past the intercept point. This was Shilka's moment. At a range of roughly 500 meters, the ZSU-234 Shilka finally opened fire. 4 23mm autocannons unleashed a solid wall of rounds, streams of tracer slicing through the night in a last, desperate attempt to saw the target out of the sky. Across the base, sirens wailed. Loudspeakers screamed orders for personnel to get underground. The carefully layered geometry of the air defense network collapsed into a single command run. 10:56 a.m. The warhead of the lead Uragan rocket felt steel beneath its nose. It punched straight through the roof of hangar number 3 and detonated on impact. Nearly 90 kilograms of high explosive drove downward, then rebounded outward, ripping the front wall apart in a single, violent pressure wave. 1 heartbeat earlier, it had been a sealed hangar. The next instant, it became an open wound. 2 160 strategic bombers burning inside. Deeper within, stored munitions and fuel began to detonate in sequence. Another explosion followed, lower, heavier, blowing the roof upward like a manhole cover before flinging it back down in twisted, flaming sheets of metal. Hangar number 3 didn't collapse. It vanished into fire, debris, and black smoke. Seconds later, the second surviving Uragan slammed into Hangar No. 1, the base's primary Tu-160 shelter. It pierced the doors at a shallow angle and exploded inside, snapping one bomber at the wing root. The shockwave tore through maintenance bays, flipped a fuel truck outside, and scattered burning debris across the apron. In less than 1 minute, 2 ground-launched strikes turned the pride of Russia's strategic bomber force into roaring fireballs. Even Russian commanders were forced to acknowledge severe losses among the Tu-160 fleet. On the battlefield, that meant fewer airborne long-range launch platforms. Inside the Kremlin, it meant something else entirely. Enormous pressure bore down on Putin as peace negotiations tightened, because every Tu-160 burned away reduced his strategic leverage hour by hour. Today's video ends here. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Goodbye and see you again in the next video.